Today we have Gunnar Menzel from Capgemini joining us to talk about architecture.
It's for you as an architect to challenge appropriately and really think about the wider implications. I mean, you mentioned sustainability before briefly. When you look at, some of the things that is currently happening within society, within our planet, you have wider responsibilities, and we all have wider responsibilities. It's typically the architect who would kind of, maybe ring the bell or, bring out these things and say, oh, are you aware these are the things that might happen if you go this way? And it's all about this option balance. And it's what I always say to my architects as well. It's not for you to making the decisions. You are the facilitator of the decision-making process.
Yeah.
So you are there. It's for the client, it's for the customers, for the stakeholder to make the ultimate decision. If he or she decides this is the best way to go, even if it's not sustainable, for instance, you can't stop, and you shouldn't. It's not for you to stop, unless, of course, you have on moral grounds and then you leave. But it's for you to facilitate that conversation and really.
It's interesting. Sustainability. It's super key, isn't it? Actually, it's interesting that actually a lot of the time architects have been thinking about sustainability, but technical sustainability maybe in terms of how much is this going to, or financial sustainability, like how much is this going to cost to maintain or run or operate when the project team are perhaps focusing on right before it gets done. And I am just overgeneralizing. I appreciate that not everyone that's working on project delivery is just thinking about hitting the sort of date at the cheapest route possible.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like actually, so as architects, we get this sustainability piece because we think about it as one, as you say, as one of many concerns and considerations and trade-offs we need to make. And so that's why I'm quite passionate about Architect Tomorrow. Is not just about the technology considerations and the business considerations, but it's about that sustainability piece. It's about, as you say, looking at the challenges we face as a society and thinking about what can we do as architects to ensure these sorts of trade-offs and these considerations are brought to our business stakeholders. Because you're right, we ultimately can't make the decisions. Perhaps sometimes some architects feel they can, and that's where they get into conflict with their business stakeholders. But actually, how do we surface up, how do we make very visible what the implications are on, running lots of, computationally expensive, machine learning models, well, that's using a lot of energy, where does energy usage and sustainability in the kind of planetary sense start to kind of work into projects? Because I think if it doesn't hit the, ground there, it won't necessarily hit the ground anywhere else, right?
It comes back to the discussions we had at the beginning. It's all about, simplification.
Yep.
So in simplification, I mean by that, I mean, being able to abstract such like an architect typically does, and being able to put into perspective, into pictures. I mean, if you look at sustainability, some of the numbers are really mind-boggling. Something I think we've overslept in the IT industry for many years. If you look at ICT as a total, so all the compute power that we have and storage or network capability we have worldwide, it contributes 3% of CO2. So
I remember you saying actually in a recent blog that's similar to the aviation industry, isn't it?
Which is pre-COVID. So aviation fuel, yes. So similar to aviation fuel. I mean, another way you could see this, if you were to assume all IT, so the entire IT industry was a country, it would be number 3 in terms of electricity consumption worldwide. So number 3 in the world. I don't know who's 1 and 2. I can't remember. I think it must be China and US.
Probably is.
But
yeah.
It's significant.
That's staggering.
There's another staggering number that I saw. Is there was a video that was released in 2016 or 2017, and that was the first video that reached 5 billion views on YouTube. And 5 billion views on YouTube equates to 40,000 US households consuming electricity per year.
Wow.
So it's their consequences of IEC or ICT or an IT per se, that we have to do something with. And again, the architect is typically, it's not always the case, of course, and we are generalizing, but typically, particularly enterprise and solution architects are typically the ones that are tasked with making the right choices when it comes to solutioning. And when you're making right choices, you have to make sure that you have all the input parameters, all the various different aspects on the table. And like you say, I mean, consumption of electricity, and it's not just consumption of electricity, of course, there's also, how you dispose of
the hardware and so on. Yeah, I mean, you know what, as you've been talking, it's made me realize, actually, we talk a lot about technical debt, and there's also increasingly been this talk of cybersecurity debt, but there's environmental debt, isn't there? And I guess where my head is, we've been making a lot of sort of decisions over, since the IT industry has existed about often throwing compute power at a problem rather than solving the problem the right way.
Yeah, because
No?
it was cheap, it was
Because it was cheap.
commoditized.
But it was cheap.
It was a standard model. I mean, look at BCP.
Yeah.
So, you have business continuity plans,
Mm-hmm.
and typically you have, what was the standard model we've been running for 20 years? Dual DC.
Mirror.
So dual DC, live, ideally both operating,
Yeah.
so both running at the same time. You only have one live, the other one kind of hot standby, so you could switch over. And while it's a perfectly okay design, and it works, and it helps to mitigate risk, but you do have to ask yourself: do you really need 100% on the second site? Now, could you live with maybe 50% or 25%, or could you live with having it dormant? Switch it on, and then maybe you have an hour outage or 2 hours outage. How do you really need 5 nines, or is it really 4 nines? Because the shift between 4 and 5 is significant. Or could you cope with 3? So there's certainly, there is a discussion to be had, and availability, scalability is one aspect. There are other areas, of course. When you look at the setup of pre-production environments, for instance, versus production environments, you will have many environments, or many organizations have full live-like production environments that are in pre-production to do OAT, operational testing.
But for me, I think people perhaps think of this as just almost an ethical issue. I don't think it is, because if you tackle this in the right way, you're surely reducing the complexity of your infrastructure, but you're also, if you're thinking about how you write the right code, and you're kind of making things more efficient, that makes leaner code, makes things more flexible, adaptable. And I think in many cases there's other benefits. I mean, clearly there's a cost benefit. I think sustainability and cost, in most cases, may perhaps it's over the longer term, but often have a cost implication, right? Often in a positive sense. But also I think a business agility. I think if you can do things better and remove some of that debt, I mean, the kind of technical debt phrase I know is probably one of the things that's really poorly understood, around kind of making these trade-offs, these technical trade-offs that perhaps are shortcuts. But for me, it feels like something which there's a whole host of other really positive side effects from just thinking about some of this stuff more, and almost swinging the pendulum more in favor of doing things better. And the engineering, and comes back to our point we started with, really, around the professionalization of what we do, the kind of taking it seriously, doing it, doing a better job rather than a lazy job, which is, oh, well, we've always done it that way. We'll throw twice as much capacity as we need, because then that's safe.
I think so. I think it's all about being efficient and effective.
Yep.
Like you say, I mean, being CO2 conscious or sustainability conscious, having this honest level pegging with availability. So you think about solutions from an NFR perspective, you think about availability, think about scalability, you think about performance, think about sustainability in the same level. So think about, how do I become most sustainable with the challenge or the problem I have at hand? I mean, sometimes you have to build service to deliver certain capabilities, absolutely. Yeah. But how can I do this in the most effective way? And like you say, incidentally, you then probably become more efficient, because you have to think about more effective ways of using the compute power that you do have, or the storage that is there, or the network transport that is available to you, rather than, like you said, just build something bigger because it's there, because it's commodity, it's cheap. And I think that's certainly.
Actually, your perspective on how much of the move that companies are making towards the cloud is almost how much of this now is within an organization's control, because with kind of offloading that sort of infrastructure layer to perhaps a cloud provider, I guess there are still choices you can make in how you architect your solutions for the cloud. But what's your perspective there? Do you think the cloud providers are taking this sort of seriously, or do you think this is something that we will still, as architects across the stack, need to think about?
Great question. So first of all, I think, particularly when you look at the big cloud providers, I think that most of them are taking it seriously or very seriously. If you look at the top ones, they've been building green data centers for at least 8 or 10 years now. Yep. Particularly when you look at data centers, so you have the PUE rating, so the power to energy efficiency. Okay. And it was always kind of, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but we are moving towards the one, and one is good. Basically, it's the amount of energy you put in, you get out in terms of processing power. And cloud providers certainly kind of moving much more now into kind of a green capability. But the point you made is a very important one, because it's not just that you use renewable energy to power a data center. Think about the procurement of the kit. Now, who's building the kit? What is the CO2 footprint or the sustainability footprint of the kit that's been built by the vendor to transport from the site where it's been produced to the location where it's been installed? Then, of course, you consume or you operate the kit for, say, 3 years. After 3 years, you swap it out. How do you dispose it? So what is the disposal process? It's also sustainability. It's not just CO2. So you need to think a bit wider. And then, of course, if you were to use a cloud provider, say a public cloud provider, it's everything surrounding as well. So what are your footprint from a sustainability perspective? And, there's another example which... another thing that I kind of been stipulating or thinking about, when you buy, looking around, I don't have anything here, but say you go to, in the UK, you go to Tesco's or Sainsbury's or other supermarkets that are available, you buy a sandwich, and on the back of the sandwich, it tells you exactly the calories, the fats, the content, everything. If you buy...
You need a sticker that tells you the other considerations as well, right?
Precisely. And or you buy a fridge or you buy a freezer or whatever, even cars nowadays, you know exactly what the footprint of this product is. In IT, we don't really do this yet. So when you, I don't know what our Zoom footprint is. I don't know how much CO2 we are currently creating or populating because we using Zoom. You have a video camera, or using broadband, we're using an application. The same applies to YouTube, to Twitter, to LinkedIn. Now, all the services that we consume as IT, we don't really yet know exactly what the footprint of these are, how much impact they're creating.
I think really good point, actually. I don't think many people are thinking that way. Like, people are just using their devices and people are using their equipment and not really even thinking about the fact that I plug this into the wall and I charge it, and that has an implication. Once this phone, stops working, or this camera, that's going to end up on landfill somewhere. That's, or it could, there's some really horrific things I've seen recently around how, electronic waste is disposed of, in developing countries and
shipped onto massive containers somewhere out of sight, out of mind.
It's always, because it's away from us.
Yeah.
We kind of live in this world where we don't really live in, increasingly sort of coming to the realization that we don't really live in the real world. We have this sort of very privileged existence, particularly in Europe and the US, where, we kind of have all these services, we get to do all these things, but we don't see the drawbacks. We kind of we get a lot of the payoff, but we don't see a lot of the downside. And I think that means we don't really, because we don't feel the pain of where that bit of equipment goes, we don't really give it a second thought. I give that to the council tip and they deal with it. Yeah, but what happens after, no one has any idea what happens. And there was a great documentary recently on this. So I think this point about, kind of an architect's being key to sort of, we know about making these trade-off decisions, but that's why, I come back to the point of Architect Tomorrow, is trying to kind of raise the awareness of some of these points around, it's not just about the time, cost, quality in business terms, there are wider implications. And I think increasingly these things will be business considerations as well. Of course they will be, because brands are going to be rated on their...
They are already. I mean, if you look at, if you look at, I'm not an economist, but we seem to be shifting into like a new economy. Whereas I grew up in kind of a product-based economy, so we're building things and physical assets. And then we moved, particularly in the 1990s and 2000s, and kind of more like a service economy, where suddenly everything was like white collar, and services was the main commodity that you consumed. Now, is what many people say, we're moving more into a purpose economy, where you as an organization have to have a purpose, where you are being assessed against your wider impact into society, particularly after COVID-19. I mean, we, Capgemini, we have a research institute. I think, interviewed 10,000 people or 15,000 people. They're in the CPRD domain, and I asked them about their behavior, their buying behavior. And I think, again, don't quote me on the numbers, can't remember exactly the number, but I think it was 73% who quoted, who said that I will only buy a product from a company where I know the company had made a positive impact to COVID-19, either directly or indirectly. And there's a purpose sense behind it. So meaning, if you are a bank, if you are, okay, car is maybe not the best example, but use another sector that's not so tainted with sustainability. If you sell something, shoes or clothing, sustainability will become a key entity of your product. So which means if I buy a sweater or a jeans, I want to know that this has been produced, sourced, delivered in a very sustainable fashion. And sustainability doesn't just mean CO2, it has wider implication. Meaning for us as architects, we do have to consider these things either directly or indirectly, and sometimes, like you said, against the will of the project, because the project only lives for a period of time. Projects, it's not right to say they don't care. Of course they do care. We all care, but they have a particular scope. They have a scope. They have to deliver against the scope.
Yeah.
You as an architect sometimes, and that's where the conflict sometimes comes, you have to take a wider, particularly if you're an enterprise architect, you have to take a wider view, and that's sometimes in conflict with the project. And then
I'm coming up with a phrase in my head, maybe we can work on this together in the future, which is like architecture is for life, not just for the project, or yeah, it's kind of a play on the puppy's not for life, sorry, puppy's for life, not just for Christmas.
Which incidentally also has then the negative aftertaste of us seeing ourselves as being too important. Sometimes we are the ones who say, well, either my way or the highway. We say the right thing, and then it's the only way.
Yep.
It doesn't work. You need to find balances. It's about
the trade-off.
It's like your coalition. So again, UK maybe not the best example. Germany always been, I think they've been a coalition government for many years.
Yep.
I'm quite used to kind of balancing things off and making the right decisions for both parties. And I think as an architect, you have the same. You sometimes have to think more in like a coalition-based style. Okay, how do I get this consensus gone or agreed? Because you both want to achieve an outcome. The project has to deliver, and you as an architect, you need to receive the service. So I think maybe you have to think in that way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed kind of exploring some of these things, but I'm conscious of time, so let's kind of move towards a close. But what I'm trying to do with all these videos is ask the person I'm speaking to about what they see the future of architect being, given the channel and the community is Architect Tomorrow. There's two questions here. One is, what do you see as the kind of future of architecture? And I appreciate we touched on some of this already, in terms of so A, the architects themselves, the profession, and B, architectures. What are you seeing as sort of emerging trends in the profession and in architectures?
So first, I guess against the profession, I mentioned those 4 skill areas: technical, design, sector, and consulting. And I think the last 2, sector and consulting, will get more and more important. I think particularly when you look at organizations that deploy very agile ways of working, where you as an architect are not just on your own or working with some developers, you're working with everybody, the project manager, so delivery manager, with the business, sometimes even the consumers of those services that you're delivering. So you have to have a much more rounded view across things, particularly from a sector and from a skills perspective. I do believe, and I'm a passionate supporter, as you can tell, for the architects community. I love being an architect. I always enjoy designing solutions with the technical skills that I think I have or still have, communicating and presenting and finding those consensus between different stakeholders, sometimes quite difficult, but it's always extremely satisfying, particularly when you look at the outcome. When you look at solutions that have deployed, some of the things that nobody will take away from you. I implemented one of the first banking services in Germany at Deutsche Bank in the 90s that was online available over the internet. Granted, you could only see the balance of your account, and that balance was 1 day old. There's nothing you could do, but it was pretty cool. So for me, an architect has a key role to play in making the right choices, managing complexity, reducing risk, reducing cost, increasing value for money, making best use of technology, balancing various different aspects. And I think the architect's the best role that can do that, because it's in its nature of the scope of the role. It's not just a developer, it's not just a business analyst, it's not just a project manager. You have to have a wider skill set, and that's also quite difficult because I always get asked, how do you become then an architect? It sounds so grand. I have to know all these things and I have to have like 30 years of experience. Of course, that's not the case. You can start in certain areas, but it is quite, particularly when you're an enterprise architect or solution architect, I think it's quite a challenging role. If you think about trends, I think I was asked a question the other day, and it was a fascinating book called The Second Part of the Chessboard.
Okay.
That's written by McAfee, co-written by McAfee, released probably 6 or 7 years ago, maybe even longer. But they were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to figure out, answering the question of, we've seen so much innovation over the last 20 years. Over the next 20 years, will this just continue, or are we seeing a plateau, or is it going to drop?
Is there a limit?
Yeah, because I mean, again, when I grew up in IT in the 1980s, 88, 87, 88, there was no internet, there was no mobile phones.
Yeah.
You look, old person now, but now we look at the capabilities we have, it's just mind-boggling. This is only for a period of like 25 years.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So the question they asked was, will this just continue? And they made lots of different assessments, and they came up with the idea of saying, well, they think we're at the half of the chessboard. When chess was invented, and the guy who invented chess went to the king 3,000 years ago in Persia, and he said, this is this game. The king said, oh, fantastic game, I love it. What do you want? You can name any prize. And says, oh, I don't really want much, just one rice corn, the first square. And he doubled it each time. And the king says, perfect, we'll do that. Not knowing that by the time you get to half, you can't produce as many rice corns. It's impossible. And McAfee said that they think we're just before that point. They truly believe, MIT and some clever people think that it's just going to increase. So what it means to us is like, wow, we have DevOps, DevSecOps, we have Agile, we have IAF and TOGAF and Segment, you have cloud and microservices and IoT and 5G. And it's like, I think it will just increase. It seems, if you look back 2 or 3 years ago, if you look forward now another 3 years ago, with all the uncertainty of COVID, of course, but also with all the development that's happening, 5G is a good catalyst. If you look at, I saw another number. I think there's a total of 33 zettabytes of data across the world that switched. 80% is in data center and 20% is on handsets. And predictions are that in 5 years' time, that's going to invert. You're going to have 6 times more data, but that data is 80% on handsets and 20% on data centers. So that means, we need to think about edge computing, that's about microservices, cloud computing. What are we going to do with our traditional tin? All these challenges we have today would just go further and more. And I think the more you'll see these development appearing and think there's more and more demand for people like us.
I was right. Exactly the point I was going to make is there's no chance of there being a shortage of things for the architect to kind of worry about or consider.
No, absolutely not. No, it's probably the other way around. There's a shortage of architects to help us to deal with all these challenges and making the right choices, reducing complexity, reducing cost and risk.
Good. Look, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thanks again for making the time. And it's been really insightful for me to learn about your kind of background and your perspective on architecture. So thanks again. Any kind of closing comments?
I think the key really is, when you look at the architect's career, and you think about, well, what is it I actually want to achieve, or how do I get more into architecture, or how do I take it more seriously? I think for me, it's really those 4 key things. Make sure you retain the IT knowledge and the hunger of knowing stuff in IT.
The curiosity, I think, is super important, right?
I think it is, and the more you can, the better, of course. There's, of course, always drawbacks and implications. I think designing solutions, you have to have also kind of a design heart, to really kind of want to kind of, classes half full type of approach.
And a creative flair as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So having a white sheet is not really a problem. It's actually an opportunity. Rather than some people see that as a stress point. I love this because you start thinking and think about the sector to really appreciate and understand like you said, understand your customer, your client, the sector you're working in. The better you understand, the better you can design with the technology skill that you have. And then last but not least is something that you can learn really easily. The first three are a bit more trickier. The last thing that is really easy to attain is your consulting skills. Being able to present, being able to communicate, being able to listen, which is sometimes very difficult for us from an engineering background because we like to talk, because we've always been asked to talk, like here. So it's sometimes hard to do, but the consulting skills, I think if you follow those or focus on those four things and balance them with some kind of plan in mind, 2 or 3 years, I think you're well suited. And like I said before, I mean, if you believe what McAfee and others are saying, there's we haven't seen the start yet. So I think there's so much more to come. 2025, 2030, 2035, when I hopefully retire. 2040, when you all have to work still. So there's world is your oyster.
Great stuff. Thanks, Gunnar.
No problem, Olivia. Thank you.